In this video, I'm going to be discussing the wax passage from the second meditation. So in coming to know myself as a thinking thing, or in Descartes coming to know himself as a thinking thing, and coming to know the piece of wax, Descartes offers two examples of very different ways of coming to know the essences of things, or answering that classic question of Plato, what is it? So let me see if I can zoom in here just a bit. So that classic question of what is it? And both answers, both what I myself am as a thinking thing and what the piece of wax is as an extended thing, both answers to those questions will be guided by an innate idea that's something like Plato's forms. And this is going to be especially evident with the piece of wax, and we're going to want to see what Descartes has in mind here. And he really makes this more explicit in the third meditation, but I think you can see it at work behind what's going on in the wax passage as well. And what I'm going to be doing in this video is trying to lay out how that's the case, or laying out how that's the case. So, so when Descartes examines the wax and tries to figure out how he knows it distinctly, he'll try to figure out how he knows what it is, that is, what its essence as a substance is, which is as an extended thing. And by knowing that essence, he'll be able to recognize the wax as the same again. So just as how in Plato, we had an idea of the equal, and that idea of the equal that was maybe only there faintly, right, only obscurely remembered, is what let us recognize equal things again, right? It let us recognize this equality and this equality and this equality. Oh, there's another instance of equality. Here, Descartes is looking for that idea that I have in my mind that allows me to recognize this wax as the same as this wax as the same as this wax, right? What is the idea that lets me recognize this physical thing as the same physical thing before, right? And so there's this way in which Descartes thinks we have a kind of standard in our mind that's going to let us recognize the wax again. And where does that standard lie, right? Like that's what he's looking for. So to see this, let's begin reading through the wax passage. So I'm going to begin here. So you want to be on page 84 of our book. And I'm going to begin here at let us consider. Let us consider the things which people commonly think they understand most distinctly of all. That is, the bodies which we touch and see. I do not mean bodies in general, for general perceptions are apt to be somewhat more confused, but one particular body. Let us take, for example, this piece of wax. So already here we see a difference with Aristotle, right? Descartes is going to focus on one case, our knowledge of this particular piece of wax, right? And he's going to be analyzing, he's going to be performing a kind of analysis of this one piece of knowledge in order to figure out, well, how is it that I know what this body is, what this piece of wax is, and how is it that I can recognize the same wax again? And he thinks what's important here is not really going to be revealed by comparing a bunch of instances of wax, right? It's not going to be revealed by taking this piece of wax and the piece of wax that I found last Tuesday and the piece of wax that I, had a month ago, and comparing my different ideas of them and coming up with an idea of what wax in general is, right? That's not going to be so helpful, he thinks. Right? So I don't mean bodies in general, but one particular body. right? So he's going to be focusing on one particular body. And in that sense, he's got a very different kind of account than Aristotle does, that we saw Aristotle had with Achilles, Buster, and Bubbles informing the concept dog, and figure out what dogs are. Okay, so let us take, for example, this piece of wax. It has just been taken from the honeycomb. It has not yet quite lost the taste of the honey. It retains some of the scent of the flowers from which it was gathered. Its color, shape, and size are plain to see. It's hard, cold, and can be handled without difficulty. If you rap it with your knuckle, it makes a sound. In short, it has everything which appears necessary to enable a body to be known as distinctly as possible. But even as I speak, I put the wax by the fire. And look, the residual taste is eliminated, the smell goes away, the color changes, the shape is lost, the size increases, it becomes liquid and hot, you can hardly touch it, and if you strike it, it no longer makes a sound. But does the same wax remain? It must be admitted that it does. No one denies it. No one thinks otherwise. So what was it in the wax that I understood with such distinctness? Evidently none of the features which I arrived at by means of the senses. For whatever came under taste, smell, sight, touch, or hearing has now altered, and yet the wax remains. So what's going on here? What's the argument? Well, we see him focusing in on things like taste of the honey, the scent of the flowers, the color, shape, or size that are all plain to see. Hardness, that it's cold, that it can be handled without difficulty. If you rap it with a knuckle, it makes a sound. So here we already see him appealing to the five senses. Right? And remember, back in Aristotle, the five sense organs, those were the ways that we took in information from the outside world. And remember, Aristotle distinguished between the three objects of sense, right? So take a moment, see if you can remember what the three objects of sense are. Okay, well, if you'd say that they were the proper, common, and incidental, then you'd be right. And those objects of sense, they were like the wax and the signet ring, right? So the object was like the signet ring, and it impressed upon the wax and created these sensible species or forms. Species or forms in the mind, right? So the object is out there in the world, and the species or forms are in the mind. And there were three different kinds of objects, the proper, common, and incidental. And those each produced in the mind different species, proper, common, and incidental. Oops. Okay, what were these proper, common, and incidental objects of sense? Take a moment, see if you can remember. Well, let's focus first on the proper ones, right? So an object of sense was proper if it could only be perceived by one sense, if it was proper to that sense, if it was specific to that sense, right? And so here we're seeing what's perceptible by taste, by scent, by color, by hardness, by coldness, by how it's handled, by how it sounds, right? And sound or color or coldness or taste, those are all proper to one of the 5 senses. And so here we see Descartes has in mind the proper sensibles, right? So it's, okay. So he's wondering whether it's through the proper sensibles that we know the wax. But he goes on, he says, but even as I speak, I put the wax by the fire and look, the residual taste is eliminated. The smell goes away, the color changes. The liquid, it becomes liquid, so it's no longer hard. It becomes hot, so it's no longer easy to handle. And if you touch it or strike it, it no longer makes a sound. So there, all of the proper sensibles have changed. But does the same wax remain? It must be admitted that it does. No one denies it. No one thinks otherwise. So we can know that the same wax remains. And so if we can recognize this same wax as there, even though all of the even though I can know that all of the features have changed, all of its proper sensible features have changed, then it can't be through the proper sensibles that I knew what the wax was, right? It can't be through the proper sensibles that I answered the question, what is it? And it can't be through the proper sensibles that I recognize it as the same wax again. And so it can't be the proper sensibles that are the standard that get us on to the wax, right? And so because I can know that the same wax remains, and yet all the proper sensibles have changed, it can't be through the proper sensibles that I know the wax. Of course, Descartes is not denying that the senses are involved in getting onto the wax at all. Obviously, we need to do this somehow, right? We need to know that the wax is there. And the senses fit that bill. Rather, he's only saying that it's not through the senses that he knows the wax's essence, it's not through the senses that he's able to recognize the wax again, right? It's not the senses that give him the standard by which he recognizes this wax as the same as that wax, right? So that's what he's arguing here. All right, in the next video, I will turn to the next paragraph and the imagination.